Sometimes the smallest glimpse is enough to change the rest of your life. That was the sentence my grandmother used to whisper whenever I asked how she had survived every impossible season fate placed before her, and I never truly understood what she meant until the morning I looked through the rain-covered bakery window and saw him standing there with a paper coffee cup in one hand and a quiet sadness hidden behind silver eyes that looked as if they had forgotten how to hope. At exactly 7 o'clock every weekday, the stranger arrived wearing the same charcoal overcoat, the same polished leather shoes, and the same distant expression that kept everyone from speaking to him for longer than necessary. The people in our small Oregon town knew him only as a businessman who had recently purchased an abandoned estate overlooking the river, but to me, he was something entirely different. He was the man I had spent 5 years convincing myself I would never see again. His name was Nathan Carter, an alpha whose presence had once belonged to a world of skyscrapers, black-tie galas, and impossible dreams, while mine had always been flower-covered aprons, early mornings, and the comforting scent of fresh cinnamon rolls drifting through a family bakery that barely earned enough to keep the lights on. Every morning he ordered the same thing, a large black coffee and a plain butter croissant, always thanking me with perfect manners, always looking directly into my eyes without recognizing me, and somehow that hurt far more than if he had remembered everything. Behind the display counter, hidden just enough to avoid being noticed, 2 pairs of curious silver eyes followed his every movement with innocent fascination. Ethan tugged gently on his sister Lily's sleeve and whispered that the tall customer looked familiar, while Lily simply smiled in that quiet way she always did whenever she noticed something the rest of us had missed. I gently encouraged them to finish arranging the blueberry muffins instead of staring, though my heartbeat had already begun racing with a fear I had rehearsed countless times in sleepless nights. Their eyes were unmistakably his, bright silver. Beneath dark lashes, a family resemblance so obvious that even complete strangers occasionally commented on it. Until now, I had always laughed it away as coincidence. But coincidence had a way of running out when destiny decided to come looking for you. Nathan accepted his order with the same calm nod he offered every morning before stepping toward the front window, where rain traced slow rivers across the glass and softened the world outside into blurred colors. For just a second he paused instead of leaving. His gaze shifted toward the children arranging pastries with careful little hands, and something almost impossible flickered across his face. It was not recognition. Not yet. It was curiosity, quiet and unexpected, as though a forgotten melody had brushed against the edge of his memory without revealing where he had heard it before. Ethan looked up at exactly the same moment, their silver eyes meeting across the warm little bakery, and neither of them spoke. It lasted no more than a heartbeat before Nathan offered a polite smile and disappeared into the rainy morning, leaving the tiny bell above the door ringing softly behind him. I stood frozen with a paper bag still clutched in my hands because deep inside I knew my grandmother had been right all along. Sometimes one glimpse was all it took for a carefully protected life to begin unraveling, and somehow I could already feel that tomorrow morning, when the clock reached 7 again, nothing would ever be quite the same. The rest of the day refused to settle back into its familiar rhythm no matter how hard I tried. I measured flour, folded dough, and greeted customers with the practiced smile I had perfected over the past 5 years, yet my thoughts kept drifting toward the quiet man who had walked out carrying nothing more than coffee and a croissant while unknowingly taking my peace of mind with him. Havenwood had always been the perfect place to disappear because everyone respected simple lives and asked very few questions. That was exactly why I had chosen this little town after leaving the city with nothing except a suitcase, fading memories, and 2 tiny heartbeats growing beneath my own. My bakery became more than a business. It became a promise that Ethan and Lily would grow up surrounded by kindness instead of pressure, by neighbors who remembered birthdays instead of board meetings, by sunsets over the river instead of endless rows of steel and glass. Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop stopped by before lunch carrying fresh daisies for the front counter, insisting that bright colors always brought better business. Mr. Collins, the retired firefighter, waved through the window before picking up his usual blueberry pie for Sunday dinner. Everyone knew everyone, and everyone believed my little family had always belonged here. Only I knew how carefully that peaceful story had been built. Ethan was arranging fresh bread on the shelves when he suddenly looked toward the front door again. He asked whether the tall customer would come back tomorrow because he seemed lonely. Children often notice truths that adults tried to hide, and I could not find an answer that felt honest enough. I simply told him that some people carried heavy responsibilities and forgot how to smile, earning a thoughtful nod that reminded me so much of Nathan that my chest tightened. Lily quietly placed another napkin beside the empty coffee cup Nathan had left behind earlier that morning before asking if she could keep it until he visited again. I gently laughed and handed her a clean one instead, pretending the request was adorable rather than heartbreaking. As the afternoon sunlight painted golden stripes across the wooden floor, I finally allowed myself to remember the city I had spent years refusing to revisit in my mind. There had been elegant lights reflected across polished marble, conversations filled with names that appeared in financial magazines, and one unexpected evening when two strangers had discovered that silence could sometimes say more than words ever could. I had never expected that brief encounter to shape the rest of my life, nor had I imagined that the confident businessman whose lonely expression lingered in my memory would one day stand inside my bakery without recognizing the person who remembered every detail of his voice. Just before closing, my phone vibrated with an unfamiliar local number. I almost ignored it, assuming it was another supplier calling about next week's shipment, but something urged me to answer. A warm professional voice introduced herself as Emma, personal assistant to Mr. Nathan Carter. She apologized for calling unexpectedly and explained that her employer wished to place a standing breakfast order for delivery every weekday beginning Monday because he had become unexpectedly busy settling into the estate outside town. My fingers tightened around the phone as I quietly accepted the request, carefully writing down the address I had hoped never to see connected to his name again. When the call ended, I stared at the handwritten order for several long seconds before folding it into my apron pocket. Tomorrow morning I would not simply watch him walk through my bakery door. For the first time in 5 years, I would be bringing a piece of my carefully protected world directly to his doorstep. The following morning arrived wrapped in a blanket of mist that floated gently above the river, turning Havenwood into a quiet watercolor before the rest of the world had fully awakened. I loaded the fresh pastries into insulated boxes while Ethan and Lily sleepily sat at the kitchen table sharing a plate of warm pancakes before school. They asked if I would be back in time to walk them to class, and I promised that I would, even though I had no idea how long the delivery might take. After checking the address one final time, I climbed into my aging pickup truck and drove through winding country roads lined with towering pine trees until an elegant iron gate appeared through the morning fog. Beyond it stood a beautiful stone estate overlooking the water, impressive without feeling extravagant, as though the house had been built for quiet reflection instead of showing off wealth. Before I could reach for the intercom, the gate slowly opened on its own. Emma greeted me at the front entrance with a warm smile that immediately eased some of the tension in my shoulders. She thanked me for accepting the standing order and explained that Mr. Carter appreciated consistency more than almost anything else. As we walked through the bright entrance hall, I noticed something unexpected. Despite the size of the home, it felt strangely empty. The walls displayed only a handful of paintings, the bookshelves held carefully arranged volumes with almost no personal photographs, and the silence carried the unmistakable weight of someone who had spent far too many evenings alone. Emma led me into a spacious kitchen flooded with morning sunlight where I carefully unpacked the pastries and fresh coffee. She complimented the aroma and admitted that it was the first breakfast her employer had finished completely since moving into town. Before I could respond, measured footsteps echoed across the hardwood floor. Nathan entered wearing a simple navy sweater instead of the perfectly tailored suits I had grown accustomed to seeing years ago, and for the briefest moment he looked less like a celebrated executive and more like an ordinary man beginning another quiet morning. He offered a polite greeting before thanking me personally for delivering the order. His voice remained calm and courteous, yet there was something softer than before, as though the peaceful rhythm of Havenwood had already begun wearing away the sharp edges of a life built entirely around work. As I turned to leave, his attention shifted toward a small sketchbook that had slipped halfway out of my canvas delivery bag. He apologized for staring and asked whether I enjoyed drawing. My heart skipped. Years ago, art had been the center of my world before responsibility demanded different priorities. I smiled gently and admitted that I only sketched whenever I found a quiet moment. Nathan looked unexpectedly thoughtful before saying that he had always admired people capable of creating something lasting with their own hands because numbers and contracts had never given him that kind of satisfaction. There was a sadness behind his words that sounded less like regret and more like someone mourning a version of himself he no longer recognized. Emma excused herself to answer a phone call, leaving us standing in the comfortable silence of the bright kitchen. Nathan glanced toward the river outside the wide windows before quietly admitting that moving to Havenwood had been an attempt to escape a life that no longer felt meaningful. He laughed softly at himself, almost embarrassed by the confession, then wished me a wonderful day. As I stepped back into the crisp morning air carrying my now empty delivery boxes, I realized something that unsettled me far more than seeing him again ever had. 5 years ago I had fallen in love with the powerful man everyone admired from a distance. Standing in that quiet kitchen, I had just met the lonely man hidden beneath that reputation, and somehow he felt even more impossible to forget. The days settled into a comforting routine that should have made everything easier, yet somehow every sunrise only complicated the quiet balance I had worked so hard to build. Each weekday I delivered breakfast before opening the bakery, and each visit revealed another small piece of the man Nathan Carter had become. Some mornings he was already standing on the back terrace with a steaming cup of coffee, watching the river drift peacefully beneath a blanket of morning mist. Other mornings he sat at the long wooden table reading reports that seemed to lose his attention every few minutes as his eyes wandered toward the trees outside instead. The conversations between us remained brief, but they gradually became less formal. He asked about the bakery, about the changing seasons in Havenwood, and about the annual harvest festival everyone in town seemed excited to prepare for. I found myself smiling more easily than I had in years, answering questions that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with ordinary life. One cool Friday morning he noticed a framed drawing tucked carefully inside my delivery bag to protect it from the rain. It was a pencil sketch Ethan had made of the bakery with oversized flowers and crooked windows that somehow captured its warmth better than any photograph could. Nathan studied it with genuine admiration before quietly asking whether my son had drawn it. The question caught me completely off guard. I hesitated for only a heartbeat before nodding, adding that both Ethan and Lily loved spending afternoons filling sketchbooks with stories they imagined together. His expression softened into a smile unlike any I had seen before, one free of loneliness, one that seemed almost surprised by its own existence. He admitted that he had always wanted a family but had convinced himself there would always be more time after the next project, the next acquisition, the next impossible goal. Somewhere along the way, those years had quietly disappeared. His words lingered with me long after I returned to town. That afternoon the elementary school hosted a small outdoor art fair where parents displayed homemade treats while children presented drawings inspired by life in Havenwood. Ethan proudly showed visitors his collection of river landscapes while Lily carefully explained every tiny detail of a watercolor painting featuring wildflowers beneath a bright blue sky. Laughter drifted through the park as neighbors greeted one another like relatives gathering for a holiday. I believed we would pass another peaceful afternoon unnoticed until a familiar black SUV rolled slowly into the school parking lot. Nathan stepped out carrying a neatly wrapped donation for the fundraising auction after Emma had apparently informed him about the event earlier that week. Several townspeople welcomed him warmly, grateful that the new resident had chosen to support the community. I felt my pulse quicken as I watched him walk through the displays without the slightest awareness that the two children standing only a few yards away shared so many of his features. Ethan looked up first. His bright silver eyes widened with excitement before he ran toward me holding one of his drawings. Nathan happened to glance in our direction at that exact moment. His attention settled on Ethan's face, then shifted almost instinctively toward Lily beside him. For several long seconds he did not speak. His expression was thoughtful rather than alarmed, as though an invisible puzzle piece had quietly slipped into place without revealing the entire picture. Then he smiled warmly at the children and complimented their artwork, telling them they had remarkable talent for noticing beauty in everyday moments. Lily thanked him with perfect politeness while Ethan eagerly handed him the river sketch as a gift. Nathan accepted it with sincere gratitude, promising he would frame it in his home. As he walked away carrying the drawing beneath his arm, I could not shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. He still did not know the truth, but for the first time destiny had placed him close enough to unknowingly carry a small piece of his own family home with him. Monday morning arrived with crisp autumn air and a sky so brilliantly blue it almost seemed impossible that anything could disturb the quiet happiness of Havenwood. The bakery was already filled with the comforting aroma of fresh sourdough and cinnamon before sunrise, and after completing Nathan's breakfast delivery, I hurried back just in time to open the front doors. Business was unusually busy because visitors from neighboring towns had begun arriving for the upcoming Harvest Festival, filling every sidewalk with cheerful conversations and camera flashes. Ethan and Lily loved mornings like these because every new face carried another story waiting to be imagined. They sat together near the front window working on homework before school while occasionally waving at familiar customers who greeted them by name. Around mid-morning, the little bell above the bakery door chimed once again, and Nathan stepped inside earlier than usual. Instead of ordering coffee, he carefully unwrapped the drawing Ethan had given him during the school art fair. It had already been placed inside a simple wooden frame. He thanked Ethan personally for the thoughtful gift, explaining that it now rested on the desk in his study where he could see it every morning. Ethan beamed with quiet pride while Lily smiled so brightly that several customers turned to admire the sweet exchange. Nathan asked the children about school, their favorite books, and whether they enjoyed living in Havenwood. Their answers came easily, filled with innocent excitement about fishing by the river, helping decorate the bakery for every holiday, and collecting colorful leaves each fall. I watched from behind the counter, trying to remain calm while an unfamiliar warmth settled over the room. For a brief moment they looked less like strangers sharing polite conversation and more like people who somehow belonged together without understanding why. Before leaving, Nathan purchased several extra pastries and casually mentioned that Emma had suggested inviting local business owners to a small community appreciation gathering at his estate the following weekend. He insisted there would be no formal speeches or business presentations, only good food and an opportunity for neighbors to become friends. Most people in town were delighted by the invitation, especially since the historic estate had remained closed to the public for decades. After he departed, Mrs. Henderson immediately declared that everyone should attend because new friendships were one of life's greatest blessings. I smiled politely, but uncertainty quietly settled inside me. That evening, after the children had fallen asleep, I sat alone beside the bakery window watching golden lights reflect across the peaceful street. My eyes drifted toward the framed photograph resting on the bookshelf. It showed Ethan and Lily on their first birthday wearing matching blue sweaters while laughing at something beyond the camera. Their identical silver eyes seemed almost luminous beneath the afternoon sunlight, captured forever in that single moment. I remembered the promise I had made to myself years earlier that I would never allow my past to complicate their future. Yet every passing day made that promise more difficult to keep. Nathan was no longer just the distant memory I had spent years avoiding. He had become part of our ordinary routine, woven quietly into breakfasts, conversations, school events, and now perhaps even family celebrations. I gently picked up the invitation Emma had delivered earlier that afternoon and traced my fingers across the elegant handwriting. It was only a neighborhood gathering, nothing more, yet something deep inside warned me that the evening waiting beyond those estate gates would become the moment when carefully hidden truths began moving steadily toward the light, whether I was ready for them or not. Saturday evening arrived wrapped in soft golden light as families from across Havenwood gathered at the Riverside estate carrying homemade desserts, fresh flowers, and the easy laughter that always seemed to accompany small-town celebrations. The grand house that had once appeared distant and mysterious now felt surprisingly welcoming. Strings of warm lights stretched between towering oak trees, local musicians played gentle acoustic melodies near the garden, and children chased one another across the wide lawn while parents exchanged stories beneath the cool autumn sky. Nathan greeted every guest personally at the entrance, thanking each neighbor for accepting his invitation with the same genuine warmth he had slowly begun showing since arriving in town. When Ethan and Lily stepped through the gate beside me, his expression brightened almost immediately. He knelt to greet them at eye level and asked whether they had brought their sketchbooks because he hoped they would show him what they had been creating lately. Ethan eagerly produced a small notebook filled with drawings of forests, rivers, and mountain trails, while Lily carefully opened hers to reveal delicate watercolor paintings of birds resting among colorful leaves. Nathan studied every page with patient attention, asking thoughtful questions that encouraged both children to explain the stories behind each picture. Watching them together stirred emotions I had buried for years. Nothing about the moment appeared extraordinary to anyone else, yet every smile, every shared laugh, and every quiet exchange carried the unmistakable feeling of something that should have existed long before this evening. As twilight settled over the estate, Emma invited everyone inside for a casual dinner prepared by local caterers. The elegant dining hall echoed with cheerful conversation instead of formal speeches, exactly as Nathan had promised. Framed artwork from regional artists decorated the walls, replacing the emptiness I had noticed during my first delivery. It seemed he had been quietly transforming the estate into a home rather than simply occupying another expensive property. During dinner, Mrs. Henderson enthusiastically suggested organizing a community art exhibition the following spring, insisting that both children and adults deserved a place to display their creativity. Nathan immediately offered one of the estate's restored barns as the venue, explaining that beautiful work should be shared instead of hidden away. The idea was met with enthusiastic applause, and before long everyone was exchanging plans for workshops, music, and family activities. Later that evening, while the children joined a small group roasting marshmallows beside a carefully supervised fire pit, I wandered onto the back terrace overlooking the river. Nathan quietly stepped outside a few moments later, carrying 2 mugs of warm apple cider. He handed one to me before resting against the wooden railing beside me. For several peaceful minutes neither of us spoke. The silence felt comfortable rather than awkward, filled only by the distant laughter of neighbors and the gentle sound of flowing water below. Finally he admitted that moving to Havenwood had been the first decision in years that actually felt like his own instead of something expected by shareholders, advisors, or endless obligations. He smiled faintly before adding that every meaningful change in his new life had somehow begun with a single visit to a small bakery. My heart skipped at the unexpected confession. Before I could respond, Ethan called excitedly from across the lawn, waving for us to watch as he released a glowing paper lantern into the calm night sky. Nathan instinctively placed a steady hand near Lily's shoulder to help her safely light her own lantern, and together the children watched both tiny lights drift upward until they became distant stars above the dark river. Standing beside him, I realized the future I had spent years protecting was no longer quietly waiting in the distance. It had already begun unfolding one ordinary moment at a time, and neither of us could stop it from bringing long-hidden truth steadily closer. The morning after the gathering felt different in ways I could not easily explain. Havenwood looked exactly the same as it always had, with sunlight spilling across quiet streets and the familiar scent of fresh bread drifting from the bakery before dawn, yet everything around me seemed to carry the quiet expectation that life was preparing to reveal something long hidden. Nathan arrived a few minutes earlier than usual for breakfast, but instead of waiting near the counter, he lingered by the display case where Ethan and Lily were carefully arranging decorated cookies for the upcoming harvest festival. The children greeted him with the comfortable excitement they now reserved for someone they genuinely looked forward to seeing. Ethan eagerly described the art exhibition everyone had begun planning after the gathering, while Lily quietly handed Nathan a small bookmark she had painted with watercolor leaves and a peaceful river beneath a bright autumn sky. He accepted it with visible appreciation, promising that it would remain inside the novel he read each evening. As he slipped the bookmark into his coat pocket, his smile slowly faded into thoughtful silence. His eyes rested on the twins for a moment longer than usual, almost as though he was searching for an answer hidden somewhere just beyond memory. After they left for school, he remained standing beside the bakery window instead of returning to the estate. He apologized if his next question sounded unusual before admitting that something had been troubling him for days. He explained that every time he spoke with Ethan and Lily, he experienced an overwhelming feeling of familiarity that he could not explain. It was not simply because they resembled someone he had once known. It felt deeper than that, like hearing the final note of a song without remembering how it began. I struggled to steady my breathing as I quietly asked what he meant. Nathan looked toward the river outside before confessing that several years earlier he had gone through a difficult period marked by exhaustion, overwhelming responsibilities, and a serious accident that left parts of his memory fragmented. Doctors had assured him that some personal memories might never fully return, especially those connected to emotional stress. He laughed softly, embarrassed by how unbelievable the story sounded, yet admitted that moving to Havenwood had awakened unfamiliar emotions he could not ignore. Certain places, familiar scents, and even the warmth inside the bakery seemed strangely connected to pieces of a life that remained just out of reach. Before I could answer, Emma entered carrying several folders that required Nathan's signature. As she organized the documents, a small envelope accidentally slipped onto the floor. Nathan bent to retrieve it, but an old photograph slid halfway out before he could stop it. I recognized it instantly. It was a faded picture taken years ago during a charity gala in the city. The image captured a crowded ballroom filled with smiling guests, yet my attention froze on one small corner where two young men stood beside a balcony, laughing together without noticing the camera. Time had faded the colors, but not the memory. Nathan stared at the photograph in complete silence. His fingers lingered over the familiar face beside his own as though trying to reach through the years. Then he slowly looked up at me, confusion and quiet hope meeting in his silver eyes. He did not ask whether the person beside him in the photograph was me. Somehow, without either of us speaking a single word, we both understood that the forgotten past had finally found its first unmistakable path back into the present. The photograph remained between us like a quiet bridge connecting two lives that had been separated by years neither of us had expected to lose. Nathan studied it again before carefully turning it over. On the back, written in elegant black ink, was a single sentence from the charity event organizer thanking everyone for supporting local children's art programs. The date beneath the message confirmed what we both already knew. It had been taken 5 years earlier, only weeks before everything changed. He looked at me with gentle uncertainty rather than confidence, as though he feared saying the wrong thing might cause the fragile pieces of memory returning to him to disappear once more. I finally nodded, unable to deny the truth any longer. I quietly explained that we had met during that event, that one unexpected conversation had grown into a friendship neither of us had planned, and that life had carried us in different directions after the accident that had interrupted more than either of us realized. Nathan listened without interrupting, absorbing every word with patient attention. There was no anger in his expression, only deep sadness for the years that now seemed to exist as empty pages inside his memory. Before either of us could continue, the bakery door opened and Ethan and Lily rushed inside after school, laughing as they tried to stay ahead of the first light autumn rain. They stopped when they noticed Nathan standing beside the counter. Ethan proudly announced that his class had been chosen to help decorate the town square for the Harvest Festival, while Lily carefully removed a folded family drawing from her backpack. She explained that every student had been asked to draw the people who made them feel safe. Nathan smiled warmly as she unfolded the picture across the counter. At the center stood the bakery with flowers blooming beneath its windows. Beside it were Ethan, Lily, and me holding hands. A fourth figure stood slightly apart near the front door, smiling quietly while carrying a coffee cup. Above every person, Lily had written their names in careful handwriting. Beneath the fourth figure she had simply written Nathan. He stared at the drawing for several long moments before asking softly why she had included him. Lily answered with the simple honesty only a child could offer. She said that every family was made stronger by people who chose to care, and that he always looked happiest whenever he was with them. The word settled over the room in complete silence. Nathan slowly knelt until he was at eye level with both children. He thanked Lily for the beautiful picture and admitted that it was one of the kindest gifts anyone had ever given him. As he looked from the drawing to the twins, his silver eyes filled with quiet emotion. He gently observed that they both had the exact same unusual eye color as his own, then laughed softly as though trying to dismiss the thought before it became too important. Yet the question had already taken root. Emma, who had quietly entered carrying additional paperwork, glanced toward me with visible concern before lowering her eyes. She understood the truth even without hearing it spoken aloud. Nathan rose slowly and turned back toward me. His voice remained calm, but every word carried a sincerity that left no room for misunderstanding. He said he did not know exactly what had happened before the missing years, but he could no longer ignore the growing feeling that the answers he had been searching for were not hidden inside forgotten documents or medical records. They were standing right in front of him, waiting patiently until his heart was finally ready to recognize what his memory had not yet fully recovered. For a long time, none of us spoke because the truth had already entered the room long before any of us found the courage to give it a voice. Nathan looked at Ethan and Lily with quiet wonder before turning back to me, and I realized that protecting the past had become impossible now that the future was standing beside us. After asking Emma to give us a little privacy, I invited Nathan to sit at the small wooden table near the bakery window where every morning had begun with coffee, fresh bread, and conversations that never quite reached the answers waiting beneath them. I folded my hands together and finally told him everything. I told him about the charity gala where two strangers had discovered an unexpected connection, about the weeks that followed filled with simple conversations instead of grand promises, about the accident that stole precious memories from his life before either of us fully understood what the future might become. I explained that when I learned I was expecting Ethan and Lily, every attempt to reach him ended with kind assistance explaining that he needed time to recover and that the doctors had limited outside contact while he rebuilt his health. As the months passed, I realized I could either spend years waiting for memories that might never return or give our children the peaceful childhood they deserved. Havenwood became that promise. Nathan listened without interrupting once, his eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, he remained silent for several moments before quietly asking if the twins were his children. I answered with a single gentle nod. Tears filled his silver eyes, not from shock alone but from the weight of 5 years that neither of us had chosen to lose. He slowly walked toward Ethan and Lily, who looked at us with innocent curiosity, sensing only that something important had changed. Kneeling before them once again, Nathan spoke with remarkable tenderness. He explained that sometimes life scattered people farther apart than anyone expected, but love and kindness always found a way to guide families back together. Ethan studied him thoughtfully before asking the question that seemed to matter more than any other. He simply asked whether Nathan would still come for breakfast tomorrow. Nathan smiled through his tears and answered that if they would have him, he hoped to come for breakfast for many mornings, many birthdays, many school plays, and every ordinary day in between. Lily quietly stepped forward first and wrapped her small arms around him. Ethan joined a heartbeat later, and together the four of us stood inside the little bakery that had carried our hopes through every uncertain season. The months that followed were not about replacing lost years because no one can truly recover time once it has passed. Instead, they became a celebration of everything still waiting to be lived. Nathan never tried to erase the life we had built in Havenwood. He became part of it with patience, humility, and gratitude, learning favorite bedtime stories, helping decorate the bakery for every holiday, cheering at school art exhibitions, and filling the once quiet estate with music, laughter, and framed drawings created by two children who no longer wondered why his smile felt so familiar. On the first anniversary of the community art exhibition, the restored barn overflowed with paintings, neighbors, and joyful conversations. Hanging near the entrance was Ethan's original river sketch beside Lily's family drawing, both displayed with a small handwritten message that every visitor paused to read. It said that families are not measured by perfect timing or flawless memories, but by the courage to choose one another every single day. As I watched Nathan standing beside our children, beneath the warm autumn sunlight, I finally understood my grandmother's words. Sometimes the smallest glimpse truly is enough to change the rest of your life, because the heart often remembers the way home long before the mind does.